Was Jesus a historical person? A look at the evidence. The question of whether Jesus of Nazareth was a historical figure or a purely mythical figure is a subject of constant debate. While some claim that he was an invention, there are numerous historical sources, both Christian and non-Christian, that attest to his existence. These sources come from different cultural and religious contexts and provide strong evidence that Jesus actually lived. Below you will find 10 historical sources that prove his existence. 1. Flavius Josephus, c. 37 to 100 A.D. Josephus was a Jewish historian who wrote 2 important passages about Jesus in his work Jewish Antiquities, Antiquitates Judaicae, c. 93 A.D. In the so-called Testimonium Flavianum, he mentions Jesus as a wise man who had many followers and was crucified by Pilate. Although there were later Christian revisions, historians agree that a core of this passage is authentic. In this work he writes the following: About this time there lived Jesus, a wise man, if one can even call him a man. For he was the doer of truly incredible deeds and the teacher of all people who received the truth with joy. Thus he attracted many Jews and also many Gentiles to himself. This was the Christ. And although Pilate, at the instigation of the nobles of our people, condemned him to death on the cross, his former followers did not become unfaithful to him. For he appeared to them alive again on the 3rd day, as prophets sent by God had foretold this and 1,000 other wonderful things about him. And to this day, the people of Christians who call themselves after him continue. Flavius Josephus, Antonter 2200, also mentions the execution of James in 62 under the Sadducee high priest Annas II. He therefore assembled the Sanhedrin for judgment and brought before them the brother of Jesus, who is called Christ, named James, and several others, whom he accused of transgression and had stoned to death. 2. Tacitus, Cas 56, 120 A.D. The Roman historian Tacitus mentions Jesus in his Annals, c. 116 A.D., when discussing the persecution of Christians under Emperor Nero. He writes that Christ was executed under Pontius Pilate, a valuable independent confirmation of the Gospel accounts. Tacitus writes the following: To dispel the rumor, he shifted the blame onto others and inflicted the most exquisite punishments on those hated for their crimes, whom the people called Christians. The originator of this name is Christ, who was executed by the procurator Pontius Pilate during the reign of Tiberius. For the time being, the pernicious superstition was suppressed, but later resurfaced and spread not only in Judea, where the evil had originated, but also in Rome, where all the abominations and detestable deeds of the entire world converge and are celebrated. 3. Pliny the Younger, c. 61, 113 A.D. Pliny was a Roman governor who wrote a letter to Emperor Trajan around 112 A.D. In it, he reports on Christians who worship Christ as God. Although he doesn't provide details, his letter shows that Jesus existed as a historical figure and was worshipped by followers. He writes the following: To those who denied that they were or had ever been Christians, I recited the formula and had them invoke the gods and pray to your image, with offerings of incense and wine, and also blaspheme Christ. After that, I think they could be released. For true Christians should not be compelled to do all these things. They asserted that their entire guilt or error consisted in regularly gathering on a specific day before dusk to offer a hymn to Christ as God and to bind themselves by oath, not to a crime, but to refrain from theft, robbery, adultery, perfidy, or misappropriation of entrusted property. I therefore considered it all the more necessary to investigate the truth, even through torture, from two so-called handmaids. I found nothing but absurd, excessive superstition. For the plague of this superstition has spread not only to the cities, but also to the villages. Yet it seems possible to contain and eradicate it. 4. Suetonius, c. 69 to 122 A.D. Another Roman historian, Suetonius, mentions in Lives of the Caesars that Emperor Claudius banished Jews from Rome because they caused unrest on account of Christ. This shows that Jesus was already a well-known figure just a few decades after his death. He writes, "He expelled from Rome the Jews who, incited by a certain Chrestus, continually caused unrest." 5. The Babylonian Talmud, 5th century, but older traditions. Jewish sources, including the Babylonian Talmud, Sanhedrin 43a, speak of the execution of a certain Yeshu, an Aramaic form of Jesus, at the time of Passover, which is consistent with the Gospel tradition. It states, "On the eve of Passover, Yeshu was hanged. 40 days earlier the herald had proclaimed, 'He is being led out to be stoned because he practiced sorcery and seduced and apostatized Israel. Whoever has anything to say in his defense, let him come and say it.' But since nothing was offered in his defense, he was hanged on the eve of Passover." 6. Mara bar Serapion, 2nd century A.D. A Syrian philosopher wrote a letter to his son in which he spoke about wise men who were innocently killed, including Socrates, Pythagoras, and the wise king of the Jews, a clear allusion to Jesus. It states, "What benefit did the Athenians gain by killing Socrates, for which they were repaid with famine and plague? Or the Samians by burning Pythagoras, since their entire country was covered with sand in an instant? Or the Jews by executing their wise king, since from that time on their kingdom was taken away from them? For God justly took vengeance on those 3 wise men. The Athenians died of hunger. The Samians were covered by the sea. The Jews were killed and driven from their kingdom, living in dispersal everywhere. Socrates is not dead, because of Plato, nor Pythagoras, because of the statue of Hera, nor the wise king, because of the new laws he gave." 7. Lucian of Samosata, c. 125 to 180 A.D. Lucian, a satirist, ridiculed Christians, but confirmed that they worshipped a crucified man named Christ, who had introduced new teachings. He claims, "Christians worshipped Peregrine. After that other man whom they still worship, the man who was executed in Palestine for having introduced this new secret cult. He was the first lawgiver of Christians, who convinced them that they were all brothers among themselves after they had once converted and renounced the Greek gods, worshipped that same crucified sophist, and lived according to his commandments." 8. Celsus, c. 175 A.D. Celsus was a Greek philosopher and opponent of Christianity. He attempted to portray Jesus as the illegitimate child of a Roman soldier, but indirectly confirmed his existence. 9. Origen, c. 185–254 A.D. The Christian scholar Origen, in his Contra Celsum, refuted Celsus's arguments and pointed to Jesus as a real person who had actually lived. 10. Eusebius of Caesarea, c. 260 to 340 AD. As one of the first church historians, Eusebius cited earlier writings and recorded information about Jesus from sources that are now lost. The first 10 sources, including accounts by Roman historians such as Tacitus and Suetonius, Jewish writings such as the Babylonian Talmud, and non-Christian philosophers such as Celsus and Lucian, already provide strong evidence that Jesus of Nazareth was a real historical figure. These writings come from diverse cultural and religious contexts, making them independent confirmations of his existence. But the evidence doesn't end there. In addition to these sources, other ancient writings also point to Jesus. Particularly noteworthy are early Christian and apocryphal texts, which are based on eyewitness accounts or date from the first centuries after Jesus' life. They demonstrate that the tradition of Jesus was not merely a religious tradition, but stems from historical events. The following presents 11 additional sources that further demonstrate that Jesus was not an invention, but a historically verifiable person. 11. Gnostic writings, 2nd century AD. Some Gnostic texts, such as the Gospel of Thomas, contain statements that point to Jesus as a historical figure. Although these writings were written later and offer a different theological perspective, they refer to Jesus as a real figure. 12. Apocryphal Gospels, 2nd century AD. In addition to the canonical Gospels, there are apocryphal texts such as the Gospel of Peter and the Gospel of Judas, which tell stories about Jesus. Even though they were not included in the biblical canon, they testify to the spread of traditions about Jesus. 13. The Gospel of the Hebrews, 2nd century AD. This apocryphal gospel, preserved only in fragments, was used by early Christian communities and contains references to the life and teachings of Jesus. 14. The Egerton Papyrus, 2nd century AD. A fragment of an unknown gospel containing episodes from the life of Jesus and supporting his historical existence. 15. The Didache, 1st century AD. Also known as the Teaching of the 12 Apostles. This is an early Christian document that refers to the teachings of Jesus and implies his historical presence. 16. The Epistle of Barnabas, 1st century AD. An early Christian document that contains numerous references to Jesus and supports his existence. Assumes. 17. The Papias Fragments, early 2nd century AD. Papias of Hierapolis, an early Christian bishop, wrote about the teachings of Jesus and collected eyewitness accounts, which indicates the historical existence of Jesus. 18. The Quadratus Apology, c. 125 AD. Quadratus, an early Christian apologist, wrote to Emperor Hadrian and mentioned that in his time there were still people alive who had been healed or resurrected by Jesus, which indicates the historical existence of Jesus. 19. The Epistles of Ignatius, early 2nd century AD. Ignatius of Antioch, an early Christian martyr, wrote letters to various communities referring to the life and teachings of Jesus. 20. The Writings of Justin Martyr, 2nd century AD, 2nd century AD. Justin Martyr, an early Christian apologist, wrote numerous works discussing and defending the life and teachings of Jesus. 21. Thallus, c. 52 AD. Thallus was an ancient historian whose works are now lost but were cited by later authors. The Christian writer Julius Africanus, 3rd century AD, mentions that Thallus explained the unusual darkness at the time of Jesus' crucifixion as a natural solar eclipse. This shows that even in the first century, non-Christian historians knew about Jesus and his death. The historical existence of Jesus of Nazareth is well attested by a variety of sources. Both Christian and non-Christian accounts from the first and second centuries confirm that Jesus was not a fictional fairy tale character, but actually lived. Roman historians such as Tacitus and Suetonius, Jewish scholars such as Flavius Josephus and the Babylonian Talmud, as well as non-Christian philosophers such as Lucian of Samosata and Celsus, mention Jesus and his followers. Even opponents of Christianity did not attempt to deny his existence, but rather provided indirect confirmation of his historical reality. Early Christian writings, such as the letters of Ignatius of Antioch, the Didache, and the Gospel of the Hebrews, also assume a real person who taught, performed miracles, and was ultimately executed under Pontius Pilate. Archaeological finds and manuscripts, such as the Egerton Papyrus, further support these traditions. The abundance of independent sources makes it impossible to dismiss the existence of Jesus as pure invention. Whether one recognizes him as the Son of God or not, that he existed as a historical person is scientifically proven.